Good morning. We will pay attention to the trading business and cash transactions today. On 1 November, S. Thorpe started Speedy Traders. His capital contribution consisted of inventory, equipment, and cash in the bank. So it means all three of these assets were brought into the business. So you will debit your asset account and you will credit capital to indicate that his capital contribution increased with the total amount. The capital account will be credited with the 40,000, 76,500 and 30,000 to indicate that the total capital increased with 146,500. Capital will always increase on the credit side and decrease on the debit side because equity increases on the credit side. Then the equipment account will be debited with the value of the equipment because equipment is an asset and assets increase on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. Inventory will also be debited because it's an asset and the asset increases with the 40,000. And you will indicate that this amount was transferred to the credit side of the capital account. In the bank account, you will also show the 30,000 because the money in the bank increased and assets increase on the debit side. Equipment purchased by check, 10,000. We paid by check, so the money went out of the bank, so the bank account will be one of the accounts and the double entry will be completed in equipment. Equipment was purchased, so the equipment asset increases on the debit side and the bank will be credited. The bank account is credited with the 10,000 to indicate that the money in the bank decreased and that the equipment account was debited. Issued a check for 12,400 for inventory purchased. We issued a check, so we took money out of the bank, so the one entry will be in the bank account. What did we do with the money? We purchased inventory, so my double entry will be completed in the inventory account. We bought inventory, so the asset inventory increased on the debit side with 12,400 and the bank account is credited. The bank account is credited to indicate that the money in the bank was decreased and that the inventory account was debited with the amount. Paid Marcel Properties 10,200 for the rent of the building. We paid money, so the bank account will be the one double entry in exchange for rent of the building, so the rent will be the double entry. The bank account is credited to reduce the amount of money in the bank, and this amount will be transferred to the debit side of the rent expense account. Rent expense is an expense that will increase on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. So we increase the rent expense on the debit side with 10,200. Cash sales of goods. We received money, so the one entry will be in the bank account. And we obtained this money from sales, so our double entry will be in the sales account. Bank account is debited to increase the money in the bank, and the sales account will be credited. Sales is an income, so we increase income on the credit side and decrease income on the debit side. So the sales income will increase on the credit side and we debited the bank account. Then we also have to complete a double entry for the cost of sales. So cost of sales is an expense and we will have to increase the cost of sales on the debit side with the cost price of the goods that were sold. They gave us this amount. Where did we get the goods to sell? Out of our inventory, so our inventory account will be credited with the 9,200. Inventory is an asset. Because we sold some of the goods, we've got less inventory, so inventory will decrease on the credit side with the cost price of the goods that were sold to indicate that we've got less inventory in the business, and we debited the cost of sales account. Issued the check for 13,800 for goods purchased from Peter's Stores. We paid money, so the one entry will be in the bank. We bought goods, so that means anything that we buy with the purpose of selling in the business is inventory, so the double entry will be in the inventory account. Inventory is an asset. Assets increase on the debit side with 13,600 because we have more inventory available and the bank account will be credited. Bank is an asset that reduced because we took money out of the bank, so we show that the money in the bank decreased with 13,800 and inventory account was debited. Paid electricity by check. Electricity is an expense and we took money out of the bank, so the double entry will be in the bank account. The bank account is credited to decrease the money in the bank because assets decrease on the credit side, and the electricity account will be debited. Electricity is an expense. Expenses increase on the debit side and decrease on the credit side. Electricity will therefore increase on the debit side, and we will show that we credited the bank account with a 400. Cash sales of goods, we received money, so the bank account will be one of the double entries, and we received the money from sales, so sales will be your double entry. Bank account is debited because the money in the bank increased, and the sales account will be credited because the money in income increased as a result of the money that we received from this cash sales, and bank was debited. Then we also have to complete a double entry for the cost of sales. Cost of sales is an expense, so we will debit our expense account with the cost price of the goods that we sold, and we will credit inventory to indicate that we have less inventory available in the business. Inventory is credited to reduce the amount of inventory on the credit side, and the cost of sales account was debited. Paid 7,000 to pay for wages, so money was taken out of the bank and the double entry will be in wages. The bank account is credited to reduce the amount of money in the bank. Wages is debited to increase the total expense that we paid on the debit side. At the end of the month, we will add the total in the capital account, and the total capital will be shown in the trial balance on the credit side. Equipment also only have figures on the one side, so the total will be recorded on the debit side of the trial balance. In the inventory account, we have amounts on the debit side and credit side. Inventory is an asset. Asset always have a debit balance. Therefore, we will add up the debit side first and see what is the total amount for all the debit entries. And we will subtract the amounts on the credit side from this total to determine what is the difference between the debit and credit side. And that balancing figure, that is the difference, will be carried down to the next month. After we added the 42,125 on the credit side above the total, the amounts on the credit side will be the same total as on the debit side. The amount on the debit side and the credit side in the total must always be on the same line, and they must always be equal. No words are written next to the total. The bank account, we will also add up the debit side first of all. Then we will subtract all the amounts on the credit side from this total to work out what is the difference between the debit and credit side. And the smaller side, we will record the 10,805, and that is our balance between the debit and credit side that will be brought down on the first day of the next month. After we recorded this 10,805 on the credit side, the two totals will be equal. The balance brought down is the one that will be recorded in the trial balance. So if the balance is brought down on the debit side, the balance will be on the debit side of the trial balance. Capital has a credit balance, so we will show the balance on the credit side. All your assets have debit balances, so the balance brought down in these accounts were on the debit side, therefore we will record it on the debit side of the trial balance. Sales is an income. Income always has a credit balance, and all the expenses that we paid will all have debit balances because expenses increase on the debit side and the balance is always on the debit side. When I add up the totals, the two totals should be the same, otherwise we made a mistake somewhere. If we look at these two totals, we see that they are not the same. So that is an indication to me immediately that there is a mistake. The first thing that I will do is I will add up the debit side again, and I will add up the credit side to see if I made a mistake in the trial balance. Okay, in this case, if I add up the debit side, I realize that I made an adding mistake. So it is easy just to change the amount to 181,105. But in the majority of cases, it's not going to be so easy to detect the mistake. So if you add up the two totals and they're still not equal, you will have to go back to the ledger accounts and see if you transferred the correct amount from the ledger to the trial balance. If the balance was transferred correctly to the trial balance, then it means there's a mistake in your ledger accounts, and you will have to go and redo each entry to ensure that you've opened an account on the debit side and on the credit side. So if the two totals are not equal, it's an indication that you didn't do a debit and a credit entry.